Welcome to Eco-Terra Chronicles, storytelling of ecological injustices on the land. This is a new web series with Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, where our mission at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light is to engage communities of faith in stewardship of creation as a direct expression of our faithfulness and as a religious response to global climate change, resource depletion, environmental injustice, pollution, and other disruptions in creation. Eco-Terra Chronicles, storytelling of ecological injustices on the land, refers to historically Black and Indigenous communities in America bear witness to racial biases and environmental degradation stemming from centuries-old European normalization of genocide, colonization, and extraction of land and labor. Slavery and capitalism stripped Black people of their humanity, reduced them to the value of chattel, and exploited their labor. Categorically, women also is a group that was historically oppressed and disenfranchised by the same forces as late as 1920, when the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. The goals of Eco-Terra Chronicles are to explore contemporary voices of humans affected by historic environmental degradation to the land, and to highlight the importance of environmental justice. Our first guest today is Elder Johnnie Washington. Elder Johnnie M. Washington is a retired college professor and a member of Grant Chapel Presbyterian Church in Darien, Georgia. She is active in Presbyterian Women, and she serves on the Savannah Presbytery's Racial Reconciliation Committee. Welcome, Ms. Washington, Elder Washington, I'm sorry. It's a pleasure to have you on our very first Eco-Terra Chronicle.
Thank you, Hermina. It is my pleasure to be here. And I'm excited to get started with the questions and the discussion that we will have today.
Wonderful. So we will just get started. Do you have a reading that you would like to share?
Well, I would like to share the very last stanza of Thanatopsis by William Cullen Bryant. So live that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan which moves to that mysterious realm where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, thou go not like the query slave at night, scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust, approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams.
What does that stanza mean for you, Elder Washington?
Well, as I proceed on this journey, I hold it as my goal to live a life that will prepare me to be comfortable facing my death. I've had the opportunity to have an out-of-body experience, and that has informed me that death is not the end, but the beginning of a new life. And one, should you live well on this journey, you have nothing to fear facing the other journey.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you very much. We'll begin with our questions that we have prepared. And I'll begin with, when and where were you born? And describe your life growing up there.
I was born in Savannah, Georgia, and I'd like to share with you an interesting beginning. Hi there. You're going to enjoy the story, and I'm going to love telling it. The expectation was a boy. Sorry, but here I am. September 11th, 1935. A bouncing baby girl, quiet. Of course, I get the name Johnny from my dad, who was saving it for a boy. Through the years, I've survived the confusion that a name can create. Parents and my older sister had a baby girl who was contented with a thumb in her mouth, peaceful and quiet, simply loving. Take the bottle away and the thumb was just as tasty. From the cradle to junior high school, I sucked my thumb and enjoyed quiet times all by myself. Of course, my mind was creative and I became a great storyteller. As a child, we did not know we were poor. We lived in a loving family. We were probably the poorest members of our family. The relatives with whom we interacted all had property, nice homes, and we lived and rented in Savannah, Georgia. My early memories are first living in an apartment home on the upper floor. There were 4 units. We lived on the upper floor. And I remember my first Christmas, I was at least 3 years old. My sister and I received rocking chairs, 1 red and 1 green. They were memorable because as adults sat in the dining room area, and there seemed to have been a lot of people around, we were to sit and rock. Children did not interfere in adult conversations, so we rocked and we sat and listened. As a part of that Christmas, I also remember getting my doll, the dolls we got every Christmas, and they were white dolls. I never kept that doll, and I never kept the other dolls. I removed the little box in the back that made the doll cry. And I would also remove the item behind the headpiece that would make the doll's eyes open and close. Another toy I remember just last evening. We got spinning tops. I haven't seen one of those in a long time. But we would get a spinning top and sparkles. Typical Christmas. I'm saying I remember that as a 3-year-old because I was born in 1935. And that unit in which we lived, we could not go out the back door because there was an exit. And it was rickety. So the next year, we found ourselves at 606 Park Avenue Lane in a row house group. And we were in the middle of those row houses. But it was a single level. And I'm sure we moved because we would be safe. My baby sister was born in 1939, December 7th, 1939. I was born in the Georgia Infirmary Hospital, but my baby sister was born at home. My grandmother came to help my mother. The midwife was there, and I was sent to my neighbor's home 2 doors away. Her name was Miss Mattie. She kept me during the birth of my baby sister. At that time, I would have been at least 4. I would remember in the area where we lived, because Savannah is below sea level, whenever we had a storm or heavy rain, the area would flood. For us, it was a time to wade in the water and try to learn how to swim. For adults, it was walking into water up to their knees. Savannah still has a problem with flooding. The area where we lived off East Broad Street was very idyllic. There was an Indian farmer who had a very large field right in the front of our homes. He also had a cornfield in the back. And behind the cornfield was the sidewalks where we would get skates, and we could skate on the sidewalk during the winter months, which was another typical Christmas present, skates. We liked the garden because there was a ditch that was built around the garden to have the rainwater run off. And on that very last row, the gardener would plant carrots. He had a beautiful vegetable garden, corn and all the other vegetables. But as children, we would get in the ditch because it was deep enough for us not to be seen by the gardener. And we would pick the carrots. We would pull the carrots up out of the ground and of course run back to our homes across the lane. In the back where he had his corn, we didn't bother the corn, but we had enough grass around in our neighborhood. We could make dolls with Coke bottles, the Coca-Cola bottles, pull up the grass, wash the grass, and put the little the bottom of the grass into the Coke bottles, and we had a doll. The root of that grass was absolutely white. You could style it. We'd put it up in rollers, and of course, we would have our little beauty shop, and that was our homemade toy. Now, in the city, we had very little contact. At least my family had very little contact with whites. Our community, of course, was segregated. We went to a segregated school, East Broad Street Elementary School. We joined a segregated church, Little Bride Baptist Church on Henry Street. And we basically stayed in that neighborhood unless my mother went shopping. My mother was a housewife. 2 of the other ladies who lived near us were housewives. So we never had an opportunity to interact with any whites for any reason. When my mother did leave the home to work, she would work for a friend who was married to an Indian, and he had a grocery store on the corner of East Broad Street, near Gwinnett Street. And they sold fresh meats and chicken. So my mother would go at times to help prepare the chickens for Sunday. folks would be in on Fridays and Sundays to prepare for their Sunday meal. And of course, we had chicken every Sunday, fried chicken. We needed the community could use the grease because an Indian lived next door to us. She would involve the community by making soap. In her backyard, she had this large black pot, and everyone in the community would save their grease, and either 2 or 3 times a year, she would make this pot of soap. So everybody got a share of it. You got a large block of this soap made with potash and grease. Well, that helped me as a child because my job, and I suppose I must have been scrubbing the front porch and the outside toilet since I might have been about 5, 6 years old. Certainly from 6 on, that was my job, to scrub the front porch and to scrub the toilet in the backyard. Everyone had a toilet that flushed. You had the water tank up top, and you had a string to pull the water that flushed the toilets. So we kept them clean, and then we scrubbed the area where you sat, and we scrubbed the floor. Everyone kept their floors pretty, scrubbed using potash and that soap. The row houses were built so that if you lived between houses, you would have about 7 steps and a wooden platform at the bottom of those steps. And each week you scrubbed your bench that was on the porch, and you scrubbed your porch, and then you scrubbed the steps and the platform that was between your houses. It was a rather loving community. We had neighbors who always helped each other. I'll share with you an incident about one of my neighbors. She lived in a beautiful white gingerbread cottage on the other side of the lane. And my sister and I were sitting on the front porch. You had to sit on the front porch after you had your bath. You could not go back out because there was dirt. They were not there. It was not paved. It was sand. So we were sitting on the porch, on the bench. My sister wants to play, and I did not want to play because I loved sucking my thumb, and I was quite contented just doing that, sitting on the bench. And she says, "Let's play Mama." I says, "No." Well, playing Mama meant that you would get a peach switch. We had a peach tree in the backyard. You would get a peach switch, and she went and got the switch, and she was striking me on the arm. And she said, "Now it's your turn." Well, I was not going to release my thumb. I'm sitting there sucking. So I took the switch and I'm gently hitting her on the arm. She says, "No, more. That's not enough, more." And I did not want to be pestered. Since she was not satisfied with the way I was playing Mama, I took her arm and bit it. And of course, my neighbor, Miss Carrie, came running to get my sister, and she had to take care of her, clean her wound, bandage it up. She brought her back home. And of course, when my mother came, I got a real spanking and I was put to bed. That was the worst punishment, being put to bed in the daytime. Now, my dad worked at the shipyard in Savannah. He was a carpenter's helper. The incident that I remember about my dad, and I must have been maybe a few years old, and I'll share that with you later.
Okay. We can continue on with when you were approximately 5 or 6 years old. An event happened in Georgia that essentially shook the Black community. Would you share what happened and how that event affected you personally?
If I'm remembering correctly, and I can't, since I've told you the date of my birth, I cannot say that in 1940, this was the year that it occurred.
Yes.
But this was the incident. 2 men and 1 female were lynched in Monroe, Georgia. I had had an experience with lynching, but this experience frightened the entire community. Even though we were miles away from Monroe, Georgia, everybody was living in fear. That's one time I remember that I was really scared. We would get in early, even though we did not have a curfew in Savannah, we would still get in our homes early. We had dark shades because of the war. Whenever we heard the sirens go off, we knew we had to pull our dark shades. And that's what we did during this period because of the lynching miles away. It took maybe 2 or 3 weeks before we felt comfortable that we could move around in our neighborhood. But I remember that great fear. Now, it stayed with me for some time. I didn't know much about the Ku Klux Klan except from reading the newspapers. We had the Savannah Morning News and we had the Savannah Evening Press, except for reading the news. So I never saw a Klansman, but I knew that they were active. The experience I had as an adult that brought this incident back to me occurred in Birmingham, Alabama. I was in the Black Museum across the street from the church where the children were murdered that Sunday morning. And as a part of that virtual exhibit in the museum, I came around the corner and here was this full-blown exhibit of a Klan outfit. Beautiful. White satin covered buttons, made probably, one would assume, in Paris. It was simply pretty. I wasn't afraid because the magnificence of it, it was a garment to admire. And the hood, all of the openings perfectly finished. And as I stood there looking at it, saying to myself, a rich person would wear this, a person of some influence would buy this type of garment. But why? For the reason they used it. And those who could not afford it, to just use a bed sheet. Why? Why? That took me back to the time when my father was threatened with being lynched. As a carpenter's helper, working at the shipyard in Savannah, he was asked by his boss, sit here, John, and will you just wait until I get back? I'll return shortly. Will you just sit here and wait for me? And of course, that's what my dad did. sitting there waiting for his boss to return. Shortly thereafter, he was arrested, taken down to the Savannah jail. The Savannah jail at that time was located on the waterfront in Savannah. When he was placed in a cell, he said he could hear the policemen talking. Their conversation was, "Let's lynch the nigger." My dad says he stayed on his knees all night. He did not sleep. He prayed. Well, I was probably about 4 or 5, and I remember my mother walking the floor because my dad had not come home. The next morning, his boss knocked on the door and he said, "Thelma, John was arrested last night, but we'll get him out of jail." And of course, that's what happened. He was bonded out of jail. And we discovered that the charges were, while sitting there, as he had been asked to do, he was arrested for eyeballing a lady working on the ship. Under her shield said he was eyeballing her. And that's why he was arrested. Well, we were poor, but we had to get the best lawyer in town, and that was Lawyer Crabbage. He was a Jewish lawyer. And my mother went to court and my dad. And of course, my dad was released. And my mother said the judge told the lady, who was not a very attractive lady, her eyebrows had been singed, burned off, short. Maybe not basically unattractive, but not anyone would go out of their way to eyeball. The judge said to her, "Lady, if you do not want anyone to look at you, you will have to stay out of the public." That incident affected my family. I did not feel a tremendous impact at that time on me personally, because as a child, I was more concerned about my mother's actions and how it impacted her. She was terribly upset. It impacted the family because we had to find the money for the attorney. But what I did feel in terms of anyone being lynched, and I was old enough to know that something was terribly wrong, lynching that lady and those 2 men in Monroe, Georgia. That stayed with me a long time. I did not hear any more discussion about my father's arrest and his being charged with eyeballing the lady and being threatened with being lynched. We never discussed it. And as I think about it now, I wish I had remembered to ask Dad, how did you feel after that and how did it impact you? But we never discussed it. It was a dead incident.